Ladies, gentlemen, and haradrim of all ages, with the first beta weekend of Diablo 4 under wraps, we thought we'd take the week leading up to our next beta period to go a bit more in depth on each of the classes that we've been playing, with my personal class of choice being the Barbarian, wielder of many weapons. My aim is to have this be a pretty complete guide to the Barbarian in the state that we have it now, up to level 25, a brief talk about the concept for anyone who hasn't played it yet, a deeper dive into the unique mechanics of the Barbarian, a talk about the legendary aspects currently available, some general concepts for gearing and how you want to gear as a Barbarian. Then we'll dive into the best current build floating around for Barbarians as of the level 25 characters that we have access to in the beta for you to check out in the public beta next weekend, and go into it with a plan for your beautiful beefy boy. So first up, what is the Barbarian in Diablo 4? Well, it's pretty much what it says on the tin. You are a massive beefcake who carries 4 goddamn giant weapons on their back at a time simply because you can. Your job is to be right up in the action, right up in the face of any enemy that you come across, and to teach them why they made a mistake engaging you in combat of any kind. The concept is simple, but it is executed wonderfully. Being up in the action feels great. You tear through enemies like nothing, and it just feels so visceral and wonderful. With that, then let's talk about some of the systems that make the Barbarian what it is, with the main one here being the Arsenal system, which is what lets you have 4 weapons at a time. 2 one-handed weapons of any kind, 1 two-handed bludgeoning weapon, and 1 two-handed slashing weapon. This is just the basic description of the system though, as it actually does quite a bit more. Each weapon that you can equip as a Barbarian gives you a passive bonus just for having it on. As you use that weapon more and more, the passive bonus gets stronger up to level 10, which gives you a bonus effect too. Each of the 7 are different, and this lets you customize your build in entirely different ways to other classes. Of course, the beauty of this is that you get the passive bonus just from having the weapon equipped in general. It's not just when you're using it, it's when you have it on. You can pick and choose which weapon that you use for each of your skills as well for maximum efficiency, but even if you are using a skill that uses your two-hand slashing weapon, the bonuses from having a two-handed bludgeoning weapon equipped will be in effect, so on and so forth, meaning you just get 4 passive bonuses simultaneously that you get to choose from this pool. Past that, of course, there is a technique slot as well, which we don't have access to in the beta, but we know what the slot does. It allows you to pick one of the Arsenal passives to be active permanently. Say that you want a build based both around bleed and vulnerability, which is a common thing for Barbarians in their current state. The bonus for a two-handed axe is extra damage to vulnerable enemies. The bonus for a two-handed sword gives you bonus damage as bleed for a percentage of the direct damage that you deal. Both of these would be great in part of the same build. However, they occupy the same weapon slot currently, and so normally you can't have both passives on simultaneously, unless you use this technique slot, which makes that possible. Past that, Barbarian also has a number of semi-unique functions that it focuses around that other classes don't really get. It has bleed as a mechanic, and while every class has some sort of damage over time effect, Barbarian is the only one with literal bleed, which just applies damage over the course of 5 seconds after the initial hit. You also have thorns. Again, you aren't the only class with thorns, but because Barbarian is most often right up in the middle of the fight, being actively hit by attacks all the time rather than dodging them, and also because Barbarian is built to be tankier than other classes, you get more use out of thorns than anyone else, really. And Barbarian also has skills that specifically interact with thorns and make it so anytime an enemy hits you, they will get hurt more than they actually do hurt you. Past this, Barbarian also gets shouts, and these are a massive deal. These are AoE buffs that will affect both you and any party members that you have in group content. This, combined with their tankiness, makes Barbarians a great part of any sort of group content, as they can just fill a sort of tank role, while also making their party members even stronger just by being there.
I am here to help you.
With that then, let's talk about another interesting facet of the Barbarian, which is the legendary aspects we currently have access to in the beta. These can totally make or break different builds, even past what your skill tree does, and this is arguably even more so for Barbarian, as a lot of offensive legendary aspects can only be put on weapons or jewelry, and Barbarian simply has the most available slots for this, having 4 actual weapon slots, which can all be legendaries, all having their effect active at the same time. As far as interesting ones that will be pretty impactful, at least in my opinion, there are multiple legendary aspects built around switching weapons, which is done when you use a skill that uses a different one of your weapons and keep swapping between them. Some of them give fortify, some of them give guaranteed overpowers. There are a ton of bleed based aspects as well, doing things like turning direct damage into bleed damage while berserking, refunding fury from rend, which is your bleed based core skill, and one that gives you a stun chance on any direct damage to bleeding enemies as well. Then there are various ones based around core skills and basic skills. Berserking, whirlwind is a big big deal too, with some giving you extra effects when you use Whirlwind, like creating tornadoes around you, one giving you higher and higher crit chance with Whirlwind the longer that you channel it. Then some of my favorites involve Thorns, one giving you extra thorns when you're berserking, and a big deal one making it so every time an enemy hits you, you have a percentage chance to just deal your Thorns value to every single enemy around you, which is just silly in the right setup, honestly. With that then, let's talk about the general concepts for gearing. As I mentioned before, Barbarian is in this unique spot of simply having the most equipment slots in the game, which means that you are able to stuff in more legendary effects than anyone else, and you want to make sure that you take advantage of that. Past that though, there are a few things to keep in mind too. While most classes don't mind mixing stats around, they aren't really their main one. Barbarian really has no use for intelligence, which sounds sort of silly when you say it, but as far as the actual mechanical meaning, all intelligence does for Barbarian is raise your all-element resist, but that isn't really worth more than the other main stats, so just avoid it. Replace it if you get it on armor that you want to use. Strength is obviously your big damage affecting stat. Dexterity gives you crit, which is really nice too. Then willpower affects both your overpower damage and your healing amount, so it's not too bad either. Past this, thorns are great. I keep mentioning them and there's good reason for it. If you can get thorns on an armor piece, that is fantastic to have. If you have a slot in your armor pieces, stick an emerald in it so that you can have even more thorns. As far as which weapons to use, in the early game just use the highest value weapons that you come across, but once you start thinking about proper builds, the type of weapon that you have in each slot really matters because of the arsenal system we talked about earlier. Definitely put some thought into which weapon type you are after at any given time, because it does make a big difference, much bigger than a couple of DPS difference on the weapon stats themselves. One more thing to consider on gear is that the movement speed stat is arguably more important for you than pretty much any other class. We are melee, that means we have to work a bit harder to avoid the big damaging effects, and so higher move speed just makes that easier to achieve. So watch out for gear with move speed on it as well, absolutely. With that covered then, let's talk about a couple of builds I've seen going around and tried out myself. And then the flat out best build currently for a level 25 Barbarian in the beta as well. First up we have the Whirlwind build, and this is my first attempted build as it's a classic that has existed in every Diablo game so far for the most part. Build up Fury, then just spin to win doing massive AoE damage as you carve through a room. This build is pretty good. It melts in AoE, absolutely, but it struggles a little bit with boss damage as it just isn't built for that purpose. You have your ultimate ability to help out with that, but once the ultimate is over, you aren't doing much to a boss. Then we have the Bleed build, and this is arguably the opposite problem, but it does feel much better than Whirlwind overall. This one is heavily based around Rend and Flay, causing massive bleed buildup on any enemy that you come across. You get Berserking in there too for higher attack speed and massive fury expenditure, and it just lets you stack up bleed like crazy on enemies. Because Rend is an AoE ability, your AoE is still really good, but because most of your damage is bleed based, you can't really burst down an entire room. You usually have to wait a few seconds to get it done, and while this build is unbelievably effective, there is still one that is a little bit better out there that doesn't even have that problem. And that, my friends, is the Bleeding Thorns build. This build focuses on thorns above all else, but also taking sort of influence from the bleed build too. It takes thorn based passives and Challenging Shout for taunt and even more thorns, and the idea behind this is you can simply reach over 1,000 thorns as I do here, and my build isn't even complete. The result is that anytime an enemy hits you with all your buffs active, they take over 1,000 damage. As simple as that. That will one-shot any tiny enemies and do massive chunks of damage to larger enemies, so for the most part, aside from elites and bosses, you literally don't even have to swing your weapon, and they will die incredibly easily and quickly, making this build extremely efficient. Then when it comes to bosses and elites, we have loads of levels in Rend, and we also have Flay, so we can still do what we were already doing before in the Bleed build too, just building up loads of bleed on the boss so they die really easily. We have Call of the Ancients as our ultimate ability, which is fantastic single target damage too. Then we still have all those thorns on top of that, not to mention the survivability built into the build too, makes it super hard to even kill you in the first place. So let's break down this build really quick. The first step is Flay as your basic skill. This is just a nice single target generator that also applies bleed, and once you take the enhancement path they show here, you get a stacking buff that gives you up to 180 thorns with full stacks, which you get from just using Flay. In itself, that much thorns is pretty massive. Then for our core skill, we go hard into Rend, to the point that it applies 1,000 damage of bleed every time that you press it, or even more, which is 200 damage per second for the ticks, and this does stack up as you use multiple Rends. Our modifiers on this make it extend the duration of vulnerability on enemies, and our Flay also has a chance to make enemies vulnerable when you hit them with it. So this interaction is a really nice synergy, especially for single target, that has a chance to make enemies debuffed and stay debuffed to just take even more damage from all sources. On top of this, our Rend refunds some Fury on use, which just lets you spam it even more. I've got 4 points in Rend, but you can find armor to give you Rend points, which is fantastic to have. You can even overcap past 5 points by doing that to give you massive power with Rend as your main single target damage source, really. Then the third slot is a bit of a personal choice. I've been messing around with Ground Stomp, which is alright, but enemies that are stunned will not be hitting you and thus they don't trigger your thorns. This is mostly just for the cooldown reduction you can get on your ultimate from using it. Another option is Rallying Cry for movement speed and fury generation, or even Death Blow in the weapon mastery section, just for another damaging skill if you feel like you need it. The bread and butter skills that you need remaining though are 2 defensive, one being Iron Skin. This gives you a massive barrier in relation to how low your health is when you press the button, and with our modifier it also heals us while active, just making you incredibly tanky and reducing the amount of potions that you need to consume over the course of a dungeon. Then we have Challenging Shout, and this one is extremely important. This taunts all nearby enemies to make them attack you over other targets for 8 seconds, as well as applying 40% damage reduction to you for that time period, but it's the upgrades that make this truly great. While active, you gain 20% bonus maximum life, and you also get thorns equal to 50% of your max health. This is scaling thorns. This is the good stuff right here. Then we get these passives over here because they increase your thorns even more. Outburst gives you 50 thorns, but then also 17 thorns for every 21 maximum life bonus you have, which interacts in a lovely way with Challenging Shout's upgrade path. Then Tough as Nails is the one that makes this build properly function as well as it does. It increases all of your thorns by 60%, literally just making this build so good. On top of that, when enemies hit you, they take 1% of your thorns as additional bleeding damage, so you can see how the build synergizes well, combining bleed and thorns around a couple of specific skills. There is also the option of the Hamstring passive further down. This will come into play in full game, but as part of this build, we just don't really have the spare points for it right now. Hamstring makes our bleed effect slow enemies too. Now keep in mind that not only do we have bleed on our basic and core attacks, but any enemy that triggers our thorns will also be bleeding for 5 seconds afterwards. So basically, anything you are in combat with will be bleeding at all times. This passive makes all of those things slowed. Not only does this help control a group of enemies, but there are various effects on gear in the game that increase your damage against slowed enemies as well as crowd-controlled enemies, which include slowed enemies as well. So this passive simply lets you apply that bonus damage to anything that is bleeding, which again is anything you're in combat with this build. Then finally we have our ultimate ability, Call of the Ancients. This one is simple. It provides you a really nice consistent source of single target damage every 50 seconds whenever you need it. It also works great in AoE, so it's just a really strong ultimate ability that can't really be used poorly. As for gear, there is one big legendary that makes this work better than anything else, and that is the one I have on my weapon. This makes it so anytime an enemy hits you, you have a 44% chance to deal your thorns in an AoE around you. This is a low roll. It can go all the way up to 80%, which is just insane, honestly. Imagine when you have 10 enemies hitting you all at the same time. If half of those trigger thorns twice, also in a pop around you, the damage is just ridiculous, especially if you have over 1,000 thorns. Past this, you sort of just want utility legendaries, things that can make you a bit tankier to let you apply thorns easier, and there is also a legendary that increases the attack speed of your basic skills, and that can make Flay hit insanely quickly, which is a good one to have as well. Outside of that, your armor should have as much thorns on it as possible. You can also get thorns on your amulet, and ideally all of your armor will have loads of sockets on it so you can shove in emeralds for even more thorns. My build is far from complete, and you've been seeing me use it here. I only have 3 pieces with thorns on them, and I'm missing a ton of potential sockets using unupgraded emeralds. I still hit over 1,000 thorns when I'm up and running in a dungeon, and it looks just silly watching things fall to pieces while you barely even press a single button. And that's it for the build. So how is Barbarian faring so far overall? Well, if that build doesn't tell you, Barbarian is in a pretty great spot. It feels great, it is exceptionally strong, easily on par with everything else so far at level 25, and this is only the first quarter of the game. It really fits the class fantasy. It's just so well. I love the idea of the Bleed Thorns build as it backs up the playstyle concept of being right up in the face of your opponent. It just feels great. It's super effective, it's lovely, it's the class fantasy of a barbarian down to a T, and so this game is absolutely nailing that so far. If you like the sound of this gameplay, go for it. Use a barbarian and use what I've told you today to make it as effective as possible. I hope you've all enjoyed this class guide for the Diablo 4 beta Barbarian, and of course drop any tips that you may have for Barbarian down in the comments below so other people can see them too. Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.